네, 안녕하세요. 저는 금융투자협회 조사국제부의 김한조 차장입니다. 오늘은 룩셈부르크 주재의 금융투자 자문 서비스 회사인 비스트라하고 공동으로 EU 그린딜과 대체투자 기회, 룩셈부르크를 통한 역외 투자 시에 고려할 사항이라는 주제로 여러분과 함께 웨비나를 진행하려고 합니다. 저희 협회에서는 코로나19로 해외 현지 방문이 제약이 있는 회원사들과 해외에서 국내를 방문하시고자 하는 다양한 파트너들과 함께 지난해부터 온라인 웨비나를 계속 진행하고 있고요. 올해는 이번 세미나가 9번째 행사입니다. 오늘 웨비나 시작에 앞서서 오늘 웨비나 진행상 유의사항을 간단하게 좀 먼저 말씀을 드리겠는데요. 오늘 웨비나에 사용되는 이 프로그램은 On24라는 시스템이고 기존에 저희가 사용했던 줌이나 웹엑스하고는 조금 다르긴 하지만 기본적인 배치나 화면 구성은 굉장히 유사하고 질문을 지금 채팅창에 한글이나 영문으로 보내주시면은 저희가 이쪽 스피커분들한테 전해드리도록 하겠고, 오늘 특별히 웨비너를 위해서 On24의 관계자께서 직접 웨비나에 참석하셔서 실시간으로 지원을 해주고 계십니다. 오늘 웨비나는 저희 인사말이 끝나고 영어로 기본적으로 진행이 되고요. 오늘 사회는 비스트라의 이성희 이사님 한국분께서 진행을 해주실 예정입니다. 오늘 비스트라와의 웨비나를 간략히 소개를 드리면 비스트라에 대한 소개와 인사말이 간략하게 이어지겠고, 첫 번째 주제인 유럽 EU 그린딜과 대체투자라는 주제로 Fidelity에서 발표를 해주시겠고, 두 번째 역외투자 시의 고려사항, 룩셈부르크를 통한 역외투자 시 고려사항에 대해서 PwC에서 약 20분간 두 분이 발표를 해주시겠고요. 그 다음에 10분 동안 저희가 Q&A를 진행할 예정입니다. 오늘 발표 중간에 3개 정도의 간단한 객관식 팝업 창으로 설문이 진행이 될 예정이고요. 굉장히 단순한 질문으로 구성되어 있으니까 당황하지 마시고 클릭하시면 될 것 같습니다. Before we start the webinar, I would like to thank Director Jay Han, Research and International Affairs of COFIA, and Jervis Smith, Country Managing Director of Bistra, and Ms. Yoon-hee Kim, a representative of Luxembourg Trade and Investment Office for arranging this event from the beginning. Today we have more than 100 participants joining us from many countries like UK and Luxembourg, United States and Germany and Netherlands, as well as Korea. I also express my heartfelt gratitude to all the Korean and international audience for being here with us despite your busy schedule. I hope today's webinar will be helpful for better understanding of EU Green Deal and cross-border investment scheme, and this can be the starting point for more active business exchanges in the future between today's audience from Korea and the EU. Now I'll hand it over to today's moderator, Director Song Lee, Bistra in Luxembourg. Good morning, Song.
Good morning. Good afternoon. 감사합니다. 김한조 차장님. 안녕하세요. 여러분, 비스트라 룩셈부르크에서 재직 중인 이성이라고 합니다. Hello everyone. Thank you for joining us today. I am your moderator for today's webinar. My name is Song Lee. I'm a director at Vistra Luxembourg, currently leading a real estate and infrastructure team with highly qualified professionals providing fund operational services for both regulated and unregulated structure in Luxembourg. While we are serving and working together with global asset managers, we have seen lots of attentions and interest coming from Korea into the European market. And size of the funding from Korea was simply phenomenal. And lots of topics, and you can see on the screen, have been raised and discussed on almost every day. So although there was a silent moment due to the pandemic situation last year, but now we see the market is opening up again, and the funds are being launched, and a lot of new deals are coming through, and a lot of new deals are also in the pipeline. So therefore, we thought it would be a great opportunity to set up a webinar with Korean asset managers and investors to refresh their view and also bring them up to the speed what is happening in Europe at the moment. And we also further extended our invitations to the local players in Europe. So we do really hope that this webinar will not only provide very informative and practical knowledge, but also bring some synergy among players in Korea and Europe for existing and also future projects going forward. And please allow me to also express my humble appreciation to Mr. Hanjo Kim at Kofia, and also Ms. Uni Kim, leading Korean office of Luxembourg Trade and Investment, for their tremendous support and also thoughtful ideas on this webinar. Before we kick off, let me share some housekeeping items. If you have any questions during the webinar, please send them to us from the question panel on your screen. Your questions are only visible to you and the speakers, not with the entire audience. So you don't really need to be shy. So please ask many questions as you can, and we will answer them during the webinar or at the end of the webinar. If you cannot get your questions today, do not worry. We'll follow up with you directly via email. If you're facing any technical issues or difficulties, we suggest that you just log out and log back in, as this typically resolves most of issues. But we also recording this webinar, and then after the webinar, we'll send you a link. So do not worry that you won't miss anything while you're reconnecting. As you can see on the screen, we are going to cover 3 topics today. And at the end of each presentation, there will be a short polling question that you can participate in. And at the end of the last presentation, we'll have a Q&A session. So now please allow me to take the honor to introduce our speakers today. Ms. Natalie Westerbarkey, she's a director and head of EU public policy at Fidelity International. She's a committee member of European Fund and Asset Management Association. With more than 15 years of experience, she was appointed as vice chair of the Investor Education Platform since 2018. Her main focus areas, including but not limited to, are global fund distribution, ESG, sustainable finance, and Green Deal. Prior to joining Fidelity, Natalie was with Abu Dhabi Investment Authority for 3 years, overseeing regulatory risk, compliance, and public affairs. Prior to that, she was a director at Citigroup in London. Today, Ms. Natalie will present the Green Deal and how it could bring more opportunity in the alternative investment industry in Europe. Next, Mr. Thierry Braem is a tax partner at PwC Luxembourg. As an alternative investment tax leader at PwC, he has been involved in the structuring of various European investment on behalf of Korean investors. Thierry has been closely working with the Korean clients on cross-border European inbound acquisitions. I believe some of the audience today actually had a chance to meet him in person, as he frequently travels to Seoul to promote the Luxembourg market. Today, Thierry will present various structuring considerations involving Luxembourg and why Luxembourg is the place that you want to be. Last but not least, Mr. Jarvis Smith is our country managing director of Vistra Luxembourg. He has more than 35 years of experience in banking and financial sector. Prior to joining Vistra back in 2019, Jarvis spent 25 years with Citibank in 4 different locations: New York, London, Hong Kong, and Luxembourg. During his time in Hong Kong as a head of sales for APAC, he developed various relationships with several Korean asset managers and banks. Today, Jarvis will introduce Vistra and how Vistra can assist you as a business partner to succeed your business in Europe. Jarvis, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Sung, and good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. Firstly, let me say how proud we are to partner with our friends at COFIA in this very important seminar about Luxembourg and the Green Deal. I won't take up too much of the time, but I would like to say a few words about Vistra and how we assist companies and investment houses, both real estate, private equity, infrastructure, to establish Luxembourg structures. As you can see from this slide, we started in 1986 and we are headquartered in Hong Kong. Vistra is in 46 countries around the world, and we're one of the leading fund administration and corporate services houses in the world, so top 3. Our 5,000 colleagues around the world are involved in helping clients right across the value chain in supporting the setup in various jurisdictions, including Luxembourg, of course, where we have 250 staff. We remain involved right from the setup all the way through to the liquidation of a structure, and can help all along the line, whether it's with the acquisition, in setting up the companies, doing the due diligence on the transactions, or whether it's monitoring and developing the products throughout the life of the structure, or then at the end in the redistribution of the proceeds of the structure to the investors and the shareholders. For the fund companies that use us, we can provide what we like to call a one-stop shop. So people can use us for various different services, or if they want a turnkey solution, they can come to us from everything, whether it's setting up the general partner and domiciling the company here in Luxembourg, whether down in the left-hand corner of the slide, it's providing the Vistra fund management, alternative investment fund management, supervision of the structure under AIFMD, or further down in the middle here, the central administration for the fund, the shareholder record keeping, the accounting, doing the foreign exchange calculations, etc. And then when the fund invests, we can also do all of the administration for the special purpose vehicles, the holding companies of the venture capital or real estate entities that are the targets for the fund, and always underpinning everything, the depository function as well, to make sure that there's safekeeping of the assets. So the advantage of using Vistra for all of these services is that we can provide this all over the world. So wherever you're investing, the Vistra network can provide the special purpose vehicle administration and do all of the accounting, the tax, and all of the administration from a board perspective as well. So here in Luxembourg, we have 42 nationalities. We speak over 50 languages, including, as you've heard from Sung, Korean, and we can help you navigate the complexities as the regulations are so numerous, as Sung said, and particularly this year with new regulations regarding distribution, so we can provide advice and counsel on how to comply with the regulations coming in August on distribution, and then importantly the Sustainable Finance Directive that came out in March, and that's the target of the next speaker. So ESG, the environment, social and governance theme, has risen incredibly in importance in the European Union in the last 5 years, largely because the governments are moving to protect future generations. And before I hand over to Natalie to go through the Green Deal, perhaps I could go to the first polling question for the audience. So do we have the polling question? I think we do. So the question is a very simple one. Are you planning to invest in or offer sustainable products? So this would be either in Korea or elsewhere. Are you planning to look at products that you want to describe as sustainable? And then we can have, if you click on yes, no, or maybe, then we can see how prevalent this is as an issue for you in Korea.
Thank you, Jarvis. Let me just step in a bit. So thanks for your introduction and our global footprint of Vistra, and a very good overview of what business solution that Vistra can offer, and also a daily operational support to the client, as we believe that our client's success is our success. 보신 바와 같이 비스트라는 회사 설립부터 청산 업무까지 다방면의 서비스를 제공하고 있습니다. 특히 룩셈부르크 오피스는 원스톱샵 모델을 통해서 펀드 운용에 필요한 모든 서비스를 제공해드리고 있습니다. 자비스가 말씀드린 것 같이 첫 번째 폴링 퀘션입니다. 현재 또는 향후에 지속 가능한 투자 관련된 상품들을 투자하거나 제공할 계획이 있으십니까? Okay, I'll give 10 more seconds to close the poll. Okay, thank you. We are closing the poll now. So the outcome of this first polling question is, I believe that Natalie will be very excited to see. 68.2% of the audience are planning to invest or offer sustainable product. Natalie, you can take the floor.
Thank you so much. And allow me to start with saying it's such a great honor to be presenting here at the COFIA Vistra webinar. Thank you very much for the invite. So my name is Natalie Westerbarkey. I work as a director for Fidelity International, and we are a global asset manager with about 600 billion of US dollars assets under management. And we also have a huge presence in Asia, in Europe, and in Canada. So I wanted to quickly start to say a couple of words about Luxembourg. So Fidelity International, our European headquarters, is in Luxembourg, and the reason it is a choice for many of the asset managers because it has many advantages. It has a very good and long-standing asset management industry. So as many of you would know, it's actually a key jurisdiction for mutual funds. So the UCITS, the mutual funds of the EU, are domiciled very predominantly in Luxembourg and are distributed globally around the world. It is actually the largest offshore fund sold in Asia. And hence, that has attracted a lot of talent to Luxembourg, which is a relatively small country. But the advantage is that also the public sector, like the finance ministries and the CSSF, the local regulator, are very knowledgeable and are very accessible. They know the asset management industry very well. So for that reason, Luxembourg is often seen as the country of choice for domiciliation, not just of the funds, but also as an HQ, a headquarter for the asset managers. So if we look at the overview slide, we can see that my presentation, which will take about 15 to 20 minutes, is divided into three parts. The first part is on generally EU sustainable finance policies. I think that that is a very important element of the presentation to set the scene. Why is sustainable finance suddenly growing so much? And the second part of the presentation will be about the European Green Deal more specifically. And the third part will be how to gain direct and indirect investment exposures to the projects in Europe and what is the fund, a possible fund vehicle or type that can be chosen to get that exposure. Because I know here in the audience are many investment managers that are thinking about investing in Europe, and especially the third part will have some practical guidance on how to invest. So if we turn to the next slide 2, we will see that there are key 3 levels of EU sustainable finance. But perhaps I quickly explain that the drivers on sustainable finance were really the society itself. It started with the fact that in Europe there is a conviction that climate change is real, that it's man-made. So if we change our behavior, we can stop the climate from changing. And the third is that it's urgent. So it's not just the civil societies that started to see a sense of urgency here, but also the policymakers. They have adopted a whole host of regulations for financial industry, for the asset managers, for the banks, and for the insurance sector to, as they say, to green the financial system. And the key driver really was that the institutional investors themselves, they started to ask more and more for ESG-type products and funds that they wanted to invest in as an investor choice. So we as asset managers, we had to supply more funds in order to meet that increasing investor demand. But if I look at the slide number 2, so the policymakers, they have sort of looking at it at 3 levels of EU sustainable finance. The first is the EU Sustainable Taxonomy. So this was published in March 2020. It is a report that explains which economic activities are considered to be green, or economic activities that are viewed as a transition or enabling activity. For example, the production of wind farms or solar panels is a green economic activity. It also includes social and governance factors. So it makes reference to the United Nations human rights and the International Labour Organization Core 8 principles. So overall, this is referred to as ESG, environmental social governance, but only if not just the environmental, but also the social and governance criteria met, one is allowed as an asset manager to distribute a fund as a sustainable fund. So sustainable is the overarching term for ESG. The second part you would see that the policymakers are working on is to incentivize and to make it mandatory for the corporates, for the issuers of equity, to disclose and to report on their economic activity. So they would need to pretty much signal how green is the economic activity that they are undertaking. So that is a cornerstone for us as asset managers, because we rely on the data that they publish, yet at the same time we are an active asset manager. So we engage with the companies and we validate the information that they disclose, and we question also the information. We try to understand how green they are or not. And that is really the main building block of sustainable finance, so that the corporates disclose their level of green activity. And the third is the fund classification and distribution. So there is a brand new regulation that came in force in March this year, so only 3 months old. It's called the Sfdr, Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation. It has 2 articles in there, which I want to quickly show you, not the next slide, but the one after, where it says Sfdr Fund Product Classification and Distribution, slide number 4, where you can see on the right side Article 8 and Article 9 under the Sfdr are the only 2 type products that can be distributed as sustainable. And Article 6 is a fund that considers sustainable factors as a risk. But Article 8 is the one that takes ESG criteria into account with the intent to be ES or G compliant. And Article 9 goes even beyond Article 8, that one has to demonstrate as asset manager that the fund has a sustainable impact. So this is a very critical development for the asset management industry in Europe and anyone who wants to invest in Europe, because it's completely new to the industry and everyone at the moment is trying to better understand the regulation, to apply it to the funds. And Fidelity, we have, for example, classified about 40 of our funds under Article 8. If we then turn now to the next slide. So this was a quick overview. This was part 1 of the presentation, why is sustainable finance so important. But if we turn to the next slide on the EU sustainability policies, you will see on the right side there is a green pillar, sustainable finance, which was the one we just covered. It was the one where policymakers try to incentivize the private sector to become greener. The other pillars, they are public sector-driven initiatives, and one of them, called investment and growth, is the one I want to talk more about in the next part of the presentation on the European Green Deal. So it talks about the investment plan for Europe, and maybe before I commence with part 2, I wanted to say that in 2019, so we can actually turn to the next slide, number 6, the European Green Deal. In 2019, in December, the European Commission had published the Green Deal agenda and has refined it at the beginning of 2020. But throughout the COVID crisis now over the last year and this year, it only really accelerated this agenda. It made it even more important because of all of the rescue funds that the public sector has adopted to support corporates and to support countries and to support employees. It is now being repurposed, this European Green Deal. It's a core part of the European recovery coming out of the COVID crisis. So it has really moved up in importance in the agenda more than ever expected, especially through the recent development. And you can see there, I believe the knowledge on the European Green Deal in this audience is already quite deep, so I won't cover too much of the Green Deal itself. I will go in more into the investment sectors in a second. But just to remind ourselves that it has two pillars. So there is the investment plan. You can see it on the left. Is where does the funding actually come from? Where does the money come from? And the other one is the just transition mechanism. That is the pillar. Where is the money going to? So in which countries, in which projects, which corporates will that money actually flow into? So that's the EU plan, the Green Deal. If we turn to the next slide, number 7, it's a chart, and I'm confident the audience will, of course, get a copy of the slide. So you can see I've included some links for further research. This is a visualization of where the money comes from. So pillar 1, the investment pillar. And I put a red frame around the right box, private-public investments. So the EU is trying to mobilize about 279 billion of private money to flow into the projects that they are structuring with the European Green Deal. So that's the private-public partnership and co-investment opportunities that they are creating. If we turn to the next slide, number 8, the just transition mechanism, we can see in the center is, again, and I will talk more about InvestEU in the third part of the presentation to give specific projects that you can find on the internet across all sectors. And they include private equity and infrastructure projects, real-life projects. So it's not just theory, it's not just policy, but at the end of the presentation, you have some practical guidance. So if we now turn to the next slide, number 9, I have the next 3 slides carved out a little bit the industry sectors. So I know that a lot in the audience are here looking at this from a private equity perspective. So we expect that there will be opportunities for companies that will develop technologies and solutions, for example, in the energy sector. The focus, so this will be subsidized as well by the public sector. There is a focus, you can see, in renewables, naturally, that's not a surprise. But what they're also working on is to make the EU energy sector more interconnected and digitalized. So any company that comes up with innovative solutions to make the EU, which consists of about 27 countries, plus other countries that are located in the region but not part of the EU, so they want to make it interconnected and digitalized, and there's also a huge focus on decarbonizing the gas sector. Then in the industrial sector, there will also be a lot of private equity opportunities because the EU wants to decarbonize the steel and cement, but the industrial sector is much wider than that. So it includes, of course, textile, construction, electronics, and plastics. So there's a massive focus on plastic, on replacing plastic, on making all packaging reusable and recyclable. But most importantly, what the policies are trying to do is they want to pretty much promote the supply side to use more climate neutral and circular products. So when we go shopping, that we don't use a plastic bag, but something that is replaced. So we need a technology to replace plastics. And secondly, to shift the consumption patterns from a single use on the demand side. So that's something that the EU will support, and it will be phasing out old materials, and it will be subsidizing the introduction of new materials. So again, for private sector opportunities, companies, startups that develop new plastic replacement products will be, I think, very much on the rise. If we turn to the next slide, number 10, you would see that there is, of course, a substantial focus on transport and automotive. So they want to reduce the emissions by 2050 by 90%. But most importantly, at the bottom, you can see the last bullet. They want to introduce 1 million public recharging and refueling stations. So it's about building that infrastructure for the automotive sector, which will be subsidized. A lot of money from the European Green Deal will flow into that and create co-investment opportunities. Coming to the next slide, number 11. Here I included the real estate sector because they wanted to launch a renovation wave, really. The challenge with the real estate is that obviously households, private households, are incentivized to renovate. The reason is that the real estate sector is one of the highest carbon emitting sectors out of all. So there is a real sense of urgency, and this is also trying to support private households to replace the roofs, the windows, the heating systems, because inefficient housing is a key source of carbon emission. Hence, the construction sector here will be a winner. The next sector is the consumer. One thing to say on the real estate that I think is very important for this audience in terms of funds, structuring funds, real estate funds. So Fidelity, we have some real estate funds. But the spirit of the European Green Deal and the entire EU Sustainable Finance agenda is not to invest in something that is already green. That is one step, yes. But what truly is the spirit is to invest in assets, in real estate that is not green yet, but through the renovation can be transformed into green. So, and this shows, it links again with the Sfdr that I mentioned at the beginning. It's having that impact. So one could think, for example, about structuring a real estate fund with assets, with property that is not green yet, but that through the engagement and through the transition plan becomes greener. And that will be also positively supported through tax incentives. So there is a real opportunity from an asset management point of view, especially in real estate. And last but not least, before I come to the third part of my presentation, I wanted to mention consumer food products is a significant and often underestimated and overlooked sector for decarbonization. Because the agriculture is one of the way it's currently undertaking largest culprits of emissions. So they will have a food to fork strategy, and with an aim to reduce the emissions. And so what I would do now is I will come to the third part, but actually I will start with slide 13. The EU Invest, the direct exposure to the Green Deal, because I think it links to the projects and the sectors we just covered. You can see on this slide a link at the top that leads you directly through all the projects that you can co-invest in as asset managers. You can go through this list of projects that covers all countries in Europe. It covers all sectors and all types. So it goes from healthcare to automotive to energy to industrials. And the good thing about the investment opportunities for asset managers also from Korea into Europe is that these projects that have been selected, they have undergone a very thorough governance and due diligence process when they get selected by the EU. So the projects that apply for the funding, they apply for that with the authorities, so the public sector authorities, and hence they are considered from a governance perspective to be very robust and hence very low risk. And through that process is why the EU hopes that more asset managers and institutional investors co-invest in, because there is a certain guarantee behind these projects that the EU has chosen, and also not just from a governance perspective, but from a guarantee also from the EU. So I can encourage everyone to take a look at that link and simply look at the projects that are live. And there's a lot of data, financial data, as well as available on the website. And I will close the third part of the presentation by moving on to the front to slide number 12, which is a new development. It's not that new actually, but it's gaining momentum, and I think especially in the context of the European Union. So it's the European long-term investment fund, and it has its fund structure, which comes under the AIF, the Alternative Investment Fund. It's one type of alternative investment funds, but it's specifically designed to be long-term infrastructure.
Sorry to interrupt, Natalie. I think we are issuing. Hey, Natalie, can you hear me? I think we are having some issues hearing from you. Can I please ask you to log out and then log back in? And while we're waiting,
okay.
I believe that, yes, okay. I think it's actually good now. Can you try to speak again to see if everything is okay?
Can you hear me now?
Yes, please. Please go ahead.
Can you hear me now better? I apologize for the technology. Sorry. So I also thank you so much, and I'm mindful of time as well. So I included here on this last slide, which concludes the part 3, the fact that the LTIF has been in force since 2015, but it wasn't considered until now to be very successful. Only a couple of funds had been launched. It was not flexible enough for retail investors specifically. So with this fund, you also have now in future there will be a passport. So it will be simplified to invest in the LTIF because the policymakers they are reviewing the LTIF to make it more easy to invest. I included the link with more detail, and it's there in English and other languages. I'm not sure if it's in Korean, but in any EU language, you could find information on that. And for example, we at Fidelity, we have also a partnership with a provider called Moonfair to allow retail investors to participate more in private equity funds. So private equity will be made more accessible to the retail space. And with that, I conclude, and I hand it back over to the moderator and to my colleague.
Thank you, Natalie. Thank you. It was a very informative session, and sorry for the audience. I think there were some difficulties with the internet connection. But you don't need to really worry because we are going to share the slide and also the recording at the end of after the webinar. So I believe that you won't miss anything. And again, thank you, Natalie. It was a very informative session to understand how EU sustainable finance is set up, several articles that we need to worry about, and what needs to be followed, and also how the European Green Deal is structured and main focus areas that we need to be aware in several industry sectors. It is quite amazing to see that the number of LTIF actually has gone up by 67% for the last 3 months, and Luxembourg is located at top 3 destination. So I believe that we are all excited to see how the Green Deal will evolve. 유러피안 그린딜이 ESG와 지속 가능한 투자 트렌드에 맞물려서 앞으로 더 많은 투자자들의 관심을 받게 될 것 같은데요. LTIV라고 불리는 유럽 장기 투자 펀드나 민간과 공공기관의 투자를 장려하기 위해 만든 Invest EU 금융 프로그램을 직접적으로 혹은 간접적으로 투자할 수가 있어서 좋은 기회가 될 것 같습니다. Dear audience, here's our second polling question. Are you considering setting up an alternative fund through investment structure in Luxembourg? Yes, maybe, or no. 현재 또는 향후에 룩셈부르크에 대체 투자 관련 펀드를 세우시거나 투자를 할 계획이 있으십니까? Okay, the poll is going to be closed in 10 seconds. Okay, so the 40% of the audience says they are going to or considering to set up an alternative investment fund in Luxembourg, and 50% is maybe. Okay, so I think this is actually a good result to go to the next slide. Thierry, you can take the floor.
Thank you, Song. Good morning for Europe and good afternoon for the participants in Korea. I'm Thierry Braem. I'm a tax partner with Fidelity Luxembourg. I've been in Luxembourg for the last 16 years, and probably I got exposed to Korean players from the start. And actually, those days, they have been making a lot of, let's say, inbound investments into Europe. So I will be focusing on that today, but just to mention for the record that we do have also some, Luxembourg-based funds investing in Korea, and especially in Korean real estate. But today we will be focusing more on structures where you've got Korean players investing into Europe. And in terms of underlying alternative assets, if you like, what we have seen mainly is European real estate, but we have seen also some debt investments with European borrowers, and let's say we see a bit less, at least it's less obvious, more private equity or European infrastructure for the moment, but it might come. Related to the earlier questions about setting up a structure or a fund in Luxembourg, actually, for Korean players willing to invest into Europe, you've got two main routes. Either you go more direct, and most of the time you will have Korean trust willing to invest directly into an alternative asset located in Europe, or you've got more, let's say, a fund-of-fund type of investments by having Korean player entering, subscribing into, let's say, a commingled fund located in Luxembourg. And as you can see, you've got, let's say, the main difference between the two routes. The first one having more direct investments, but obviously the IMC or the Korean manager will retain more control over the underlying asset and over the management, whilst by having more fund-of-fund strategy, it's more a passive type investments, and the investment strategy will be conducted more by a local asset manager. So we've seen both, but it's a totally different type of setup, because obviously one, it's more direct, more through an unregulated structure in Luxembourg, and you've got more control at Korean level, whilst with the fund-of-fund option, the second option, it's more, let's say, a passive investment mode. So direct investments, what do we mean by direct? Actually, the structure chart will be, let's say, the ideal, investment structure for a Korean player. But in many cases, we cannot land on that structure. Why is that? Because, let's say, the first reason is that the Korean trust, for European eyes, is a strange animal. And you've got plenty of technical questions on who will be the beneficial owner of the proceeds, for instance. Is that the trust itself? Is that the AMC managing the trust, or are we dealing with indirectly via the pool of investors behind the Korean trust? So it raises plenty of questions, but plus also you've got, let's say, a mix of tax and non-tax reasons for not going totally directly into the underlying assets. You might have, filing obligations, for instance, and complex for the reasons I mentioned before, in terms of, how, from a European perspective, we will be treating, the distributions of proceeds to the Korean trust directly. Also, you might have, let's say, non-tax reasons having to do with, external leverage and external financing and the security perimeter and package. So you can see that, although, from a structuring perspective, it would be ideal to land on that structure, very simple, very straightforward. In most cases, we need to interpose something in between, and it happens that, you know, what we interpose is often a Luxembourg entity. Just to mention before I move to the next slide that we do see some examples with these more direct investments. And one example could be, for instance, having a Korean trust investing into a French OPCI, which is a kind of real estate fund in France. We have seen recently some big transactions on the French real estate market conducted directly from Korean trust investing into French speaker. So it could happen, but I would say it's not the majority. And one of the reasons as well has to do with the possibility of, you know, claiming the 14% tax refund in Korea as well. So what you can see on this slide is a typical, let's say, it's a snapshot of, you know, real estate, European real estate structures made by Korean trust, various Korean trusts into various, you know, European jurisdictions. And you can see that the common, you know, the common aspects of all these underlying investments is that you've got, you know, Luxembourg interposed in between, you know, the European assets and the Korean trust. And you can see, you know, whilst, you know, back 10 years ago, the focus, especially for real estate, for Korean players, was very much, let's say, the three usual suspects in terms of, you know, investment jurisdictions, and it was, you know, Germany, France, and the UK. There has been, throughout the year, a diversification in terms of investment jurisdictions as well. So it has gone, you know, more South Europe, like Spain or Portugal, for instance, and also East with countries like Poland. But also we've got, you know, Nordic countries, we've got Benelux countries, and actually quite recently, you know, there was also a quite material, you know, real estate investment made in Luxembourg. Yes, Luxembourg is very small, but we can have also, you know, let's say, Korean presence into Luxembourg local assets. So you can see again that the main takeaway of this slide, and actually these were parallel structure. So for each investment or each, you know, local jurisdiction, we had a different Korean trust on top. It was for simplification purposes that we have shown only a single K trust on top. Next slide. So this is a slide where you've got an overview of, let's say, a direct investment. When we say direct, it's a bit confusing because actually we do have, you know, interposed now Luxembourg in between, let's say, the local asset or the local property company and the Korean trust. And you can see on the right-hand side, let's say, the main features, the main tax considerations to tackle in Luxembourg. And one of them is obviously withholding tax upon repatriation from Luxembourg to Korea. I will say before we tackle, let's say, equity distribution, most of the time you will have also internal leverage routed through the Luxembourg entity, and on that we've got, you know, a taxable margin that needs to be a transfer pricing benchmarked. But at the end of the day, it's not, let's say, we are not talking about, you know, material amounts. What matters very much as well is the repatriation of equity proceeds, and between, let's say, the local countries to Luxembourg, usually we've got exemptions, and the key question is what will be the tax leakage, if any, upon repatriation from Luxembourg to the Korean trust. So usually we can avoid, you know, dividend distributions because in Luxembourg, we've got, let's say, a 15% withholding tax upon dividend distribution. So you've got means to avoid, you know, dividend distribution, but still you can repatriate and mitigate this withholding tax impact. But what is very specific to, let's say, Korean players entering into a Lux entity is that you can possibly claim the tax refund in Korea, the 40% tax refund. So what we are saying, whilst normally, you know, the key point of attention upon repatriation from Luxembourg is about, you know, 15% withholding tax. Obviously, if you can claim, you know, the tax refund in Korea on this 15% withholding tax, you can see that, you know, the effective tax rate is quite marginal at the end of the day. So I will say that for many countries, you know, we need to manage withholding tax in Luxembourg, but with Korean players, since in certain instances we can benefit from the tax refund in Korea, it's a different story, and actually it could be a competitive advantage for you towards, you know, other type of players that are not Korean based. So this structure is an example of what I referred as indirect investment. Basically, when you will have, you know, a Korean player entering it into a Lux regulated fund. So you can see that the main difference on the chart is, you know, the interposition, the insertion of this triangle in the middle, and it will be a regulated vehicle. And again, the main difference is that the underlying investment strategy will be conducted by the manager of this Lux fund, and this manager will not be the IMC, obviously. The other difference is about, you know, the interposition in Luxembourg. In this type of structure, usually you will consolidate your various underlying investments under, let's say, a single Luxembourg platform. Whilst with the more direct investments we've seen on the slides before, you will have several parallel structures with, let's say, a Luxembourg platform for each underlying investment. So these are the main differences here. You will be entering as a limited partner into a Luxembourg likely or fully regulated fund, and plus, generally speaking, for the investment platform below, there will be a consolidation with a single platform and not parallel structure with various interposed Lux entities. So last but not least, because I don't want to drag you into very technical details, you've got a snapshot on these slides of the main, let's say, tax considerations in Luxembourg when making, you know, European investments. On the right-hand side, you can see that you've got, you know, strange names like ETAD 1, ETAD 2, Tax 6. So these are, you know, legislations derived from European directives. And what is a bit tricky with European directives, you've got a legislative framework, but each EU member state could, you know, implement those directives in a slightly different manner with slightly different interpretation and content. And then this is where it could get tricky and very technical. So I'm going to go very quickly through that. ETAD 1 has to do with interest deductibility restrictions. It's mainly relevant for at the level of the underlying investment countries. So you need to manage that because you might have restrictions towards, you know, leveraging at local level. Also, ETAD 2 has to do with anti-hybrid legislation. So again, to reassure, generally speaking, for Korean trusts, that's generally manageable and we don't end up, let's say, with a negative landing. But again, as for ETAD 1, ETAD 2, you need to document and you need to make sure that you are on the right tracks. DAX 6, it's something else. It has to do with mandatory reporting. And you might have experienced that, you know, the implementation of this directive could be very different from one EU country to another. And for those of you who have been, let's say, exposed, for instance, to Polish investments, for instance, it's very complex in Poland, very, very burdensome. But we've got different, let's say, scenarios in Europe depending on, you know, the underlying investment country or the interposed structure. A point of attention also is transfer pricing, especially if you've got back-to-back loan financing through Luxembourg. Again, you need to document and to support your taxable margin in Luxembourg. Brexit, just one comment on that. Let's say it has, we have had, let's say, a positive, you know, impact of Brexit in Luxembourg because especially for those UK managers that you know were in the past, you know, marketing products to EU players. Now they need to find an alternative, and the main phenomenon we have seen, you know, in Luxembourg is a consolidation of having, you know, the fund vehicle the manager and the investment platform located in the same jurisdiction. But again, it has to do also with the fund manager directive, which is mainly relevant anytime you market to European investors. So I'm not sure that's the main topic of today, but just to mention for the record that with Brexit, we have had a positive impact in Luxembourg because we got, let's say, more products, more management functions moved to Luxembourg as a result of Brexit. Last but not least, and very important for you, is substance and beneficial ownership. So let's say the initial view of many players was that on those considerations was the initial view was more on the cost angle, to save cost, to do the minimum and so on. But the thing is, with the BEPS agenda and the overall tax environment, we need to balance in Luxembourg, this cost consideration, which is totally relevant, but also with risk. And the risk actually is not so much a Luxembourg risk. Anytime you might be challenged or questioned on substance and beneficial ownership, it will be a tax risk in the investment jurisdiction. But to ensure that you mitigate that risk, you will need probably to put, let's say, more substance and more, let's say, decision-making process relevant in Luxembourg. So it has an impact, I would say, on your Luxembourg operations. And again, we need to engage to discuss the right balance between, saving some costs, some running costs, but also finding the right level of substance in Luxembourg in terms, of board composition, decision-making process, and sometimes also, infrastructure. Do you need to have an office, etc., and so on and so forth. So I make a pause here. I didn't want to enter into too much technical details. It was very much a snapshot of the main tax considerations for making alternative European investments by Korean players. Thank you.
Thank you, Thierry. Thank you so much for going through two general structuring model for Korean investment, Korean investors specific. And I believe that in order to set up a structure in Luxembourg, that several tax considerations must be carefully considered and discussed with the tax advisor like you and your team PwC, and in order to enjoy all available and possible tax benefits. 앞서 말씀드린 바와 같이 투자 자산이 확정된 직접 투자의 경우 외국 납부세 환급 여부의 불확실성, 세금 보고 의무 발행 가능성, 자금 조달 방법의 제한, 수익 분배 방식의 제한, 선순위 렌더들의 시큐리티 패키지 요구 등으로 인해 룩셈부르크 홀딩 컴퍼니를 통한 투자가 고려될 수가 있습니다. 투자 자산이 확정되지 않은 간접 투자의 경우 룩셈부르크 자산 운용사가 설정한 다양한 펀드 구조를 이용하여 효율적인 투자를 고려하실 수가 있으신데요. 그 밖에 투자 구조 관련한 세무사항 혹은 룩셈부르크 세무 이슈에 대한 세부적인 사항은 PwC 룩셈부르크 Thierry 파트너 혹은 이범기 매니저님께 문의 주시면 되겠습니다. Dear audience, our last polling question is already up here. How would you rate this webinar? Very relevant, relevant, not relevant. 마지막 질문입니다. 오늘 전반적으로 웨비나가 어떠하였는지 알려주시면 감사하겠습니다. Before we go into Q&A, I understand that we are already running out of time. So, dear audience, if you can stay 10 more minutes to go through several questions during the Q&A session, then that will be really great. Okay, and we are quite thrilled by significant numbers of questions that we received during the webinar. So I'll start with Natalie, ladies first. So Natalie, I received two questions for you. The European Green Deal presents a new growth opportunity to the region and green policies, which is very similar to the role of Korean New Deal. Could you share with us the initiative impact on financial instrument and the stock market that the private sector would be interested to know? And audience would like to also know whether your company, Fidelity, has relevant funds, and if so, their performance.
Thank you so much for the question. Yes, Fidelity, we do have funds. So we have undergone extensive analysis internally and are pleased to confirm that we have about 40 funds that classify as ESG funds, and also we're planning to invest in projects that are related to the European Green Deal. And the next step would be to design also more impact funds. To give an example, one of our funds is the Water and Waste Fund, which is very popular. It invests in water utilities and infrastructure related to waste management, which is very closely connected to the EU policy of the European Green Deal. And we also have a new partnership that we've just announced with a company called Moonfair. They offer private equity funds, and the advantage is it makes it more accessible also for the retail market, because the investment threshold has been lowered the way the funds that are structured, and they are also more liquid than investing directly into private equity. So we hope that that would incentivize the retail sector to participate in the recovery after the COVID crisis, where the European Green Deal will be a core tool for recovery in terms of finance. And with that, I hand back over to the chair.
Thank you, Natalie. The second question for you today is, recent developments show that international bodies such as ICMA are actively promoting green deals and sustainable bonds by establishing relevant policies. So the European Financial Authority and EU Committee are also devising the EU taxonomy and rules for disclosure requirement. So far, it seems that incentive for the issuers involving ESG factors and the green deals are abundant. Could you tell us possible incentive for investors that are differentiated from other financial instruments, such as tax benefits, that are being discussed in the EU?
Yeah, absolutely. So tax, of course, and Thierry has covered it extensively, is a key incentive, because Luxembourg, for example, will give tax benefits for those funds that classify as ESG funds under the Sfdr. So there's a huge potential for savings. But the other big incentive for investors really is the EU guarantee. So I mentioned it during my presentation, that the projects that the EU select, they undergo a very diligent governance check. And that in itself makes them very reliable and low risk. But on top of that, the EU also has a guarantee program around these projects. So for us as investors, this gives us comfort that the selection process is very robust due diligence process, and that creates an incentive to participate in the European Green Deal projects. I hand back to the chair again. Thank you.
Thank you. Okay, Thierry, we have selected two questions from several questions for you today. So first question for you is, G7 countries recently agreed to a global minimum tax rate of 15%, and this move is likely to have a significant impact on countries that charge lower corporate tax rates. So as many financial companies and funds are registered in Luxembourg, what will be the impact of this deal on Luxembourg? Can you please elaborate on how financial companies or PwC are planning to respond to such changes?
Yeah, thanks, Song. I mean, main takeaway on that, first, it's not legislation. So you've heard over the weekend that there has been a lot of, let's say, press buzz around, this G7 and so on. So G7 has no legislative powers. And the next steps will be how those, let's say, buzz words are going to be translated into legislation. And one of the next hurdle could be actually US Congress. So we'll see that. Second point, bear in mind that, the targeted, let's say, the targeted companies of this kind of legislation are multinationals. We are not dealing, let's say, with, asset managers and so on. This being said, we need to see, and it was the case for BEPS. Again, for BEPS, the target was very much multinational, but it had collateral effects on asset managers. So we need to follow up. I will not expect this to have a big impact because for instance, for alternative structure, you expect to be taxed in the investment jurisdictions, and it's also basic fiscal principle that you should not be taxed twice for the same proceeds or the same income. I would expect this to be retained. The main follow-up point to me will be how to interpret this 15% test. In Luxembourg, for instance, we are already above 15 as a nominal rate, but the key question will be, will that be an effective tax rate, or will they be looking more at the nominal tax rate? To me, that's the main point of follow-up. But again, we are not dealing with legislation yet, and again, the main target is very much the Amazon of the world and not asset managers.
Thank you, Thierry. Thank you, Thierry. So the next question, which is the last question of the day, is related to mutual fund. So most of the fund in Korea are trust funds, and I believe that you have prepared your presentation taking this into account. And we visited a lot of COFIA and also a lot of asset management companies actually visited Luxembourg in 2019, and they have noticed many of the funds were registered as mutual fund to the management companies. So recently, APEC companies has been making effort to facilitate the registration of offshore fund by putting in a place legal framework on mutual funds such as Hong Kong's open-ended fund company, Singapore variable capital company, and Australia corporate collective investment vehicles. So do you think that these efforts will vitalize investment into offshore fund globally, or it could be a threat to Luxembourg? If Korean government adopts a legal framework for mutual fund to facilitate the registration of offshore fund in Korea, what kind of benefit can we expect from it?
So again, it's difficult to answer very shortly on that one because you've got several considerations. I will say for new fund products and new fund license, it depends very much on your underlying investments, on the type of investors you want to target, and also on the control you want to have on the vehicle. And it relates to my presentation towards whether you want to go for a more fund-of-fund type of strategy, which is more passive, or you want to have control about the underlying assets. I will not expect this to be a threat to Luxembourg because, again, it depends very much. Do you want to attract EU investors, or do you want to attract Asian investors into this kind of new vehicle? That's the first question to me. And also, in terms of underlying assets, are we dealing with European assets or Asian assets? So I will say maybe it would be a benefit, and actually sometimes in this type of structure with new, let's say, fund jurisdictions, we might have a combination, having, for example, a Singapore fund feeding into a Luxembourg fund, or the other way around. So I don't see that as a big threat. For the Korean market, frankly, I don't know, because I don't think you've got that many issues for the moment to market towards Korean players only, because you've got this phenomenon of having multiple AMCs and multiple pension funds with a lot of dry powder in Korea. To me, the question is, do you want to open your own products towards, I would say, non-Korean players? That's the key question.
Okay, thank you, Thierry. And thank you again, everyone, for your participation. And now we are moving on to the closing side. So Mr. Hanjo Kim, please take it over from here. Mr. Kim, can you hear us?
Sorry, thank you, Song. Thank you, Natalie and Thierry, for giving us a great presentation and sharing the customized information for Korean Investors Day. And I also really appreciate Manager Bong-gi Lee from PwC, and Agi from On24, and Amel from Bistra for your technical support. I hope meet all the audience in the next event. Thank you for your attention and see you next time. 제가 한국말로 좀 클로징 해도 될까요?
네.
오늘 특별히 저희를 위해서 이렇게 사회도 한국말과 영어로 동시에 봐주신 이성 이사님께 다시 한번 진심으로 감사드리고요. 저희가 이제 다음 이벤트는 6월 29일 날 인도 자본시장 투자 전망이라는 주제로 다시 한번 찾아뵙겠습니다. 오늘 조금 중간에 잡음이 있어서 약간 좀 방해를 받으신 부분이 있긴 한데 아까 이사님께서 중간에 코멘트 해주셨듯이 오늘 자료들은 다 공유가 될 거고요. 이 오늘 웨비나 한 내용들이 녹화가 돼서 이것도 이제 저희가 서브타이틀과 함께 나중에 다 저희 오늘 참여하신 모든 분들께 공유될 수 있도록 이렇게 조치하겠습니다. 오늘 웨비나에 참여해 주신 모든 분들께 다시 한번 감사드립니다.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Mr. Jarvis? Yeah, Mr. Jarvis, do you want to give a last message?
Yes, thank you very much. And thank you to all of my fellow presenters for a fascinating fly past of all of the intricate regulations around sustainability and tax. It's great to have the hands across the continent between Korea and Luxembourg. It's a great pleasure for me personally to be back in touch with my friends from Seoul. And of course, the most important thing to say is thank you to the audience for your participation and the questions. Thank you to Sung for moderating so well. And please don't hesitate to contact us. No problem is too small for us to be interested in helping you. It's great for Korea, it's great for Luxembourg, and it's great for all of us as well here at Vistra. So thank you everybody for your attention, and we look forward to seeing and hearing from you again. Thank you.
Okay, everyone, then we are going to close the webinar. Have a great day.